So listen to this. Hardly anything fuels fan excitement for a fight more than a clash between two undefeated warriors. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the most intense and unforgettable moments when fighters with perfect records went head-to-head. You're watching Octagon Chronicles, and this is our top 10 showdowns between unbeaten contenders. 10th place goes to Ilia Topuria and Bryce Mitchell. Sooner or later, the paths of these two rising undefeated featherweights were bound to cross inside the octagon. Topuria and Mitchell were climbing the ranks at the same time. The conspiracy theory enthusiast entered the fight with a flawless record of 15 wins and no losses. By then, he had already picked up 6 victories in the UFC, including a rare submission win via twister and a dominant performance over sport legend Edson Barboza, which secured him a spot in the top 10. Bryce built his game primarily around wrestling and, more specifically, grappling. On his way to the upper tier of the division, he rarely encountered serious resistance and was viewed as one of its future stars. Ilia Topuria came into the matchup with a slightly more modest record, 12 wins, 0 losses. He had 4 UFC victories under his belt, with 3 of them coming by finish. He had taken out Damon Jackson, Ryan Hall, and Jai Herbert. The war with Herbert nearly handed the Georgian his first professional loss. Moving up to lightweight without a proper camp, he was nearly knocked out but managed to stage an impressive comeback and walk away with the win. The clash between these two undefeated young prospects took place at UFC 282. Expectations were high for a competitive, back-and-forth battle, but what unfolded was anything but even. Topuria completely outclassed Mitchell on the feet, landing heavy damage early. Then he took control on the ground, dominating the grappling exchanges before choking out a worn-down Mitchell midway through the second round. Mitchell's first loss in the octagon was nothing short of a rout. The performance made the MMA world take serious notice of Ilia, and not long after, he captured the title, still undefeated. As for Mitchell, his fortunes didn't improve. Roughly a year later, he suffered another finish, this time a knockout at the hands of Josh Emmett. So his undefeated status became a thing of the distant past. 9th place goes to Lyoto Machida and Rashad Evans. Today, both of these light heavyweights are regarded as legends of their division, and their head-to-head bout back in 2009 was every bit as iconic. The Brazilian karateka came into the fight riding a streak of 15 wins with 0 defeats. Even before signing with the UFC, he had already notched victories over names like Stephan Bonnar, Rich Franklin, and BJ Penn. In 2007, he joined the world's premier MMA organization and strung together 6 straight wins, which earned him a shot at the reigning champion, Rashad Evans. Evans had been competing in the UFC for a couple of years longer. A winner of the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, he had racked up 8 fights in the promotion without a single loss. Among his highlights were a knockout of the year performance against Chuck Liddell and a successful title fight against former champion Forrest Griffin. Initially, Rashad was slated to face former title holder Rampage Jackson, but an injury forced Jackson out. In his place stepped a surging Lyoto Machida. 2 men known for their knockout power managed to avoid a finish for about 2.5 rounds. Then Machida landed clean. Evans was rocked badly and struggled to stay in the fight, dodging follow-up strikes on pure instinct. Lyoto smelled blood and shifted into predator mode. He chased Evans down, backed him against the cage, and landed a pinpoint left hook that sealed one of the most viral knockouts of that era. Rashad's first career loss was so brutal that he only processed what happened later, while in the hospital, being filled in by his corner. Despite the harsh shutoff, he made a strong comeback 6 months later and went undefeated for another 3 years, until running into John Jones. As for Machida, he defended his newly won title once but didn't keep his perfect record for long. That 0 was eventually taken in devastating fashion when he was knocked out cold by Mauricio Rua. 8th place belongs to Vitor Belfort and Randy Couture. For the Brazilian phenom, maintaining an unblemished record in the UFC wasn't especially difficult in the beginning, mainly because he entered the promotion as early as his second professional bout. Back then, the league had no weight classes and no round time limits, and Vitor himself was just 19 years old. His first 3 victories in the promotion took less than 5 minutes combined. Then, in October of 1997, the undefeated Belfort, boasting a record of 4 wins and 0 losses, stepped into the octagon to face Randy Couture. At the time, Couture was also just starting out in MMA. The fight against Belfort was only the third on his professional resume. The first 2 had been relatively one-sided wins, so this showdown between 2 unbeaten rising stars promised fireworks. But as became clear years later, the young Brazilian had let his confidence get the better of him. Certain of his dominance, he reportedly didn't take his training as seriously as he should have, expecting another easy finish. What he got instead was a rude awakening. Randy brought relentless wrestling and a gritty clinch game to the fight, wearing Belfort down over the course of 8 minutes before finishing him with ground and pound. That was the first taste of defeat for the young, self-assured prospect. For Couture, the victory paved the way to a title shot against then-champion Maurice Smith, and he capitalized on the opportunity, capturing the gold. But even Randy didn't stay undefeated for long. In his very next fight, he suffered his first loss and watched his perfect record disappear. MMA at the turn of the century was far too chaotic and raw a sport to let anyone stay undefeated for long. Still, as we know today, that early setback didn't stop either man from crafting legendary careers. Both went on to become pioneers and icons in the sport's history. 7th place goes to Holly Holm and Ronda Rousey. One of the most shocking upsets in UFC history was, on top of everything else, a collision between 2 undefeated women. Rousey entered that bout as the promotion's biggest superstar. She had already made a name for herself in Strikeforce before transitioning to the UFC, where she built a spotless record of 6 wins and 0 losses and racked up 6 successful title defenses, finishing nearly every opponent in the first round. By the time she faced Holm, Ronda held a perfect 12-0 record and carried the aura of an unbeatable champion. It came as no surprise that she was the overwhelming favorite against Holly. The preacher's daughter had an impressive background in boxing and, after switching to MMA, had strung together 9 straight victories without a single defeat. At the time, many believed that Rousey, who typically secured takedowns and won via her signature armbar, would steamroll another challenger who wasn't especially skilled on the ground. However, growing tired of winning solely by armbars, Rousey had begun relying more on her striking and had picked up a few knockouts leading up to the Holm fight, which boosted her self-confidence. Believing she could outbox the former boxing champion, she chose to stand and trade. But from the very start, she began absorbing heavy shots. Holly was leagues ahead in the striking department and imposed her will with ease. It quickly became clear that Rousey was entirely out of her element. Visibly rattled and increasingly desperate, Ronda made more and more mistakes as the fight wore on. Eventually, she walked straight into the now iconic high kick that didn't just drop her. It shattered the invincible image she had built and marked the fall of an era. Ronda's undefeated streak came to an end, and she was never the same afterward. She spent a full year away from the sport. Upon returning, she was knocked out in under 60 seconds by Amanda Nunes. Afterward, she announced her retirement from the sport. As for Holly Holm, she made a huge splash, but lost both the belt and her undefeated status in her very next fight, and never quite reached the same level she had on that unforgettable night in the cage. 6th place goes to Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa. The clash between these 2 undefeated middleweights was the most anticipated showdown of the year 2020. By that point, Israel Adesanya had compiled a flawless record of 17 wins and no losses. He had dismantled every opponent in his path to the title, delivered a legendary war against Kelvin Gastelum, and dispatched Robert Whittaker in utterly dominant fashion. It seemed as if Izzy was untouchable, but many believed Paulo Costa might be the one to finally hand the Nigerian phenom his first defeat. At the time, Borokinha had secured 12 straight victories without a single setback. Known for overwhelming pressure and explosive power, Costa was considered one of the hardest-hitting middleweights the sport had ever seen. He even stood toe-to-toe with Yoel Romero in a brutal slugfest, and managed to drop the Cuban powerhouse. That performance led some fans to think Adesanya wouldn't survive Costa's aggression. Compared to the Brazilian muscle machine, the slender, dancing Adesanya didn't exactly exude physical intimidation. Their fight was originally scheduled for earlier that year, but an injury forced Costa out. He tore his bicep and was sidelined for half a year. Yoel Romero stepped in as a replacement, only to produce one of the most forgettable title fights in UFC history. 25 slow minutes where he barely moved, seemingly frozen in time across from Adesanya. By the fall, fans finally got what they were waiting for. Tensions between Izzy and Costa escalated in the lead up to the fight. Intense stare-downs, charged press conferences, and a back and forth that could have powered the entire fight island. But to everyone's surprise, the bout itself ended up resembling Adesanya's previous fight against Romero. Costa came out hesitant, flat-footed, and oddly passive. He threw very few strikes and looked like a shadow of his former self. In the second round, Adesanya capitalized, landing a clean knockout and ending Costa's unbeaten run. Afterward, Costa claimed that pre-fight nerves got the best of him. He admitted to drinking wine the night before in an attempt to calm himself, which, according to him, left him feeling off and not in control during the fight. He pushed hard for a rematch, but he never truly regained his momentum. Over the following 4 years, Borakinha managed only one notable win, an exhausting decision against an aging Luke Rockhold. Meanwhile, Adesanya remained the undefeated and dominant force at middleweight, continuing to rule the division for years to come. Fifth place belongs to Cody Garbrandt and Thomas Almeida. During his climb to the top, the young Garbrandt collected quite a few scalps, but the showdown with Almeida stood out for several reasons. It was a clash between two electric finishers, both just 24 years old at the time. Almeida stepped into the octagon boasting a perfect record of 21 wins and no defeats. He was ranked 7th in the division and had earned performance bonuses in each of his 4 UFC appearances. Only once in his entire professional career had one of his bouts reached the final bell. Garbrandt, on the other hand, wasn't even ranked yet, but in just a year and a half, he had torn through 3 opponents in the UFC with the speed and fury of a hurricane. He had scored knockouts in 2 of those fights, extended his record to 8 wins with no losses, and only one of his bouts had gone the distance. Their meeting promised fireworks from the opening bell. The only question was which of these undefeated prospects would rise to the next level and break into the top 5 of the division. The suspense lasted just under 3 minutes. Then Garbrandt caught Almeida along the fence and turned his lights out, sending him crashing face-first into the canvas. For that spectacular performance, Cody was awarded a $50,000 bonus. The buzz around him began to grow rapidly, with fans and analysts alike starting to talk about his potential title run. Almeida, meanwhile, lost his precious zero in the most painful way imaginable. Once the aura of invincibility faded, the losses started piling up. He dropped 4 of his next 5 fights and was ultimately released from the UFC in quiet fashion, his momentum completely gone. Garbrandt, by contrast, was fighting for the title just 6 months later. In one of the most impressive performances in bantamweight history, he dismantled Dominic Cruz and claimed the championship. His own undefeated streak would eventually be snapped too, but the consequences for his career were similarly devastating. That loss marked a turning point from which No Love has never fully recovered. 4th place goes to Jon Jones and Dominic Reyes. Technically speaking, Jones shouldn't even be on the list of undefeated fighters, as there is a recorded loss to Matt Hamill on his resume. However, that particular blemish is usually treated as an outlier, not because Jones was bested by his opponent, but because he was disqualified while dominating the fight, losing only due to an illegal strike. Dana White has never given up hope of overturning that decision and restoring a flawless record to his favorite champion. Jones's opponents have always approached him as the unbeatable standard, a fighter who had never truly been surpassed inside the octagon. That aura of invincibility was exactly what Dominic Reyes set out to challenge. Nicknamed the Devastator, Reyes represented the new wave of light heavyweights. He had stormed into the UFC with ferocity, stringing together 6 consecutive wins en route to a title shot. Along the way, he dismantled opponents like Jared Cannonier, Ovince St. Pierre, Volkan Oezdemir, and Chris Weidman. By the time he entered the cage to face Jones, Reyes held a perfect record of 12 wins and 0 losses, and Reyes came closer than anyone before him to dethroning the legend. He showcased crisp striking, stuffed Jones's grappling attempts, and even managed to rattle the champion on a few occasions. But when it came to the final moments of the fight, Reyes seemed to fade just enough for Jones to edge ahead. The judges awarded the victory to the reigning champ, and the belt stayed with Jones. Many fans and analysts were outraged by the decision, calling it a robbery. But the damage was done. Reyes' perfect record was gone, and there would be no turning back. That fight marked a turning point in Reyes' career, and not in a good way. What followed was a string of 3 consecutive losses, all of them inside the distance. The promise and momentum he had built began to unravel. Meanwhile, Jon Jones has yet to encounter an opponent who has handed him a definitive, unquestioned defeat. Third place belongs to Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie. The year was 1993, and it marked the birth of the very first UFC tournament, an event that resembled organized chaos more than regulated sport. There were no formal rules, no rounds, no weight classes, no time limits, and certainly no standardized gear. It was a wild and raw spectacle featuring 8 representatives from 8 distinct martial arts disciplines: sumo wrestling, kickboxing, karate, traditional boxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, savate, and shoot fighting, a hybrid of judo and Muay Thai. Royce Gracie, the quiet but deadly emissary of the legendary Gracie clan, stepped into this experiment in stylistic warfare with a mission to demonstrate the undeniable effectiveness of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. In the quarterfinal, he made short work of boxer Art Jimerson, tying him up in knots in under 2 minutes and notching his first official MMA victory. That win set the stage for a semi-final clash with Ken Shamrock. Shamrock, a powerful and highly disciplined American athlete, came from the world of shoot fighting. With a background in wrestling and a growing reputation in the Japanese Pancrase organization, where he held a spotless record of 3 wins and 0 losses, he was no stranger to real combat. In his own quarterfinal, Ken had submitted Taekwondo practitioner Patrick Smith, and did so even faster than Gracie dispatched Jimerson. Because shoot fighting incorporated elements of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Shamrock believed he had what it took to go head-to-head with Royce. But what unfolded inside the cage revealed the gap between knowledge and mastery. In a matter of seconds, Gracie shot in for a takedown, dragged Shamrock to the canvas, flowed into a dominant position, secured the back, and forced the tap. The entire sequence took only 57 seconds. Gracie would go on to win the tournament, proving that jiu-jitsu was not just effective, it was revolutionary. Still, both fighters cemented their place in martial arts history and crossed paths twice more. At UFC 5, they fought an exhausting 36-minute battle without any breaks. That bout ended in a draw. The final chapter of their rivalry came in the year 2016 under the Bellator banner. By then both men were seasoned veterans far past their physical primes. But Gracie once again claimed victory, finishing the fight in just 2.5 minutes. Second place goes to Shavkat Rakhmonov and Ian Gary, 2 unbeaten welterweight prospects who, under normal circumstances, probably shouldn't have crossed paths at this point in their careers. Both were on a trajectory toward title contention, but Shavkat was clearly a step ahead. With a record of 18 wins and 0 losses, and all 18 coming by way of finish, he wasn't just undefeated. He had never once needed the judges' scorecards in his entire career. By the time UFC event number 310 rolled around, Rakhmonov had already tallied 6 wins inside the promotion. Among the names he had conquered were seasoned contenders like Neil Magny, Jeff Neal, and Stephen Thompson. Originally, he was scheduled to compete for the title at that event, but reigning champion Belal Muhammad sustained an injury just a few weeks out, forcing the organization into emergency mode. The matchmakers needed a replacement, and only Ian Gary answered the call. The Irishman had been slated to headline his own card just a couple of weeks later, with a bout lined up against Joaquin Buckley. But when opportunity came knocking, he didn't hesitate. This was his chance to leapfrog the division, claim the number 1 contender spot, and test himself against a training partner he knew well from their time at Kill Cliff. Gary was under no illusions. He knew exactly what kind of storm he was stepping into. It was the first truly impulsive move of his career. Up until then, he had taken a slow burn approach, carefully increasing the difficulty of his matchups and often stating publicly that he was still young and in no rush. That patience paid off. Gary amassed 15 straight victories without tasting defeat, along the way outpointing top-tier names like Neil Magny, Jeff Neal, and Michael Page. Oddsmakers had Rakhmonov as a clear favorite, but the fight turned out to be far more competitive than expected. Gary refused to be bullied. He held his own in the stand-up exchanges, won a few key moments, and even threatened with a submission attempt. Still, the fighter known as Nomad managed to do just enough to edge out 3 of the 5 rounds, preserving the 0 on his record, though for the first time in his career, the final bell was required. As for Ian Gary, He may have surrendered his undefeated status, but what he gained was perhaps even more valuable: the respect of fans worldwide. On short notice, he took on the most feared man in the welterweight division and delivered a performance worthy of admiration. First place goes to Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. Once again, we're talking about Jon Jones, who we initially didn't plan to include on this list. The duel with Cormier was the hottest rivalry in the light heavyweight division at that time, two fighters who were unmatched in their own right. Jones, with 20 victories under his belt, and DC, who came in with a record of 15 wins and 0 losses. Cormier had been the Strikeforce heavyweight champion, and upon joining the UFC, he dismantled notable opponents like Roy Nelson and Frank Mir. He then announced his move to the light heavyweight division to avoid competing against his training partner, Cain Velasquez. However, in this new weight class, he was set to face the control of the light heavyweights. Jon Jones, the youngest champion in UFC history, had already successfully defended his title 7 times by this point. He had dominated the top names of the previous generation, like Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, and Lyoto Machida, and had also crushed several current top contenders such as Chael Sonnen, Alexander Gustafsson, and Glover Teixeira. The build-up to the fight with Cormier was intense, with clashes at the stare-downs and verbal sparring and interviews. The culmination of all this was the fight at UFC 182. Jones didn't allow the Olympic wrestler to take him down. In fact, he took Cormier down himself and proceeded to dominate him on the feet, leaving no chance for a win. Cormier lost his undefeated record and his dream of becoming the UFC champion. The fighter was crushed and disheartened, but soon enough, Jones began to lose to himself, getting caught up in various incidents that led to his suspensions and stripped him of his title. In the end, DC became the champion, though he was never able to defeat his greatest career rival.